Our story begins on the American frontier, in the untamed wilderness of the 19th century. It was a world where survival was not guaranteed, but fought for each and every day. The land was harsh, the winters bitter, and the summers unforgiving. Families who dared to settle here carried their legacy not in gold or fine possessions, but in sweat, sacrifice, and the strength of their children. Mercy Harrow was one such child. Born into a family of pioneers, she came into a world where even her first cries were drowned by the howl of the wind across the prairies. Her parents, like so many of their time, believed that hardship was a teacher, and that suffering was not something to be feared, but endured. From the moment she could walk, Mercy was set to work, hauling water, tending fires, caring for younger siblings. Childhood, as we imagine it today, was a luxury she would never know. Yet, behind the sturdy log walls of the Harrow home, cracks of fragility ran deep. Mercy's family, like many others, clung to the traditions and expectations of their society. Girls were not raised for independence, but for obedience. And while men could carve their freedom on horseback or in trade, girls, like Mercy, were prepared for one destiny alone: marriage and motherhood. By the age of 12, when most children would still be learning their letters or chasing sunlight through fields, Mercy's path was already decided for her. Her family, seeking alliance and security, arranged her marriage. It was not love that bound her to her husband, but necessity, a cold transaction dressed as duty. And so, Mercy Harrow, barely more than a child, found herself a wife. The weight of her new life came swiftly and without mercy. At 12 years old, she discovered she was pregnant. In an era when medicine was primitive and childbirth dangerous even for grown women, this was a sentence of suffering. Her body, fragile and unprepared, bore the strain of adulthood too soon. Neighbors whispered, some with pity, others with judgment, but all accepted it as the way of the world. For on the frontier, survival was built on silence, on keeping your head down, and on obeying the unwritten rules. As the months passed, Mercy's once bright spirit dimmed. Her childhood was stolen, her laughter quieted. She became a ghost of herself, moving through the days as though carrying not just her unborn child, but the crushing weight of history itself. For Mercy Harrow's story was not hers alone. It was the story of countless forgotten girls, hidden behind the myths of rugged pioneers and brave settlers. Their pain rarely made it into history books, yet it was as much a part of the frontier as the axe and the plow. When the day of her labor came, it was long and agonizing. With no doctor, no medicine, only the steady hands of women who had seen too much death to be hopeful, Mercy fought for her life. The walls of the small cabin echoed with her cries, cries that spoke of innocence lost and the cruelty of a world that demanded too much too soon. Whether she lived or not is a detail history may never fully recall, but what remains is the tragedy that marked her existence. Mercy Harrow's short life became a symbol of the unforgiving reality of the frontier. It was a place that forged legends of strength and endurance, yes, but also one that buried countless tragedies beneath its soil. Her story is a reminder that behind every tale of conquest and settlement lay broken lives, stolen childhoods, and voices silenced before they had the chance to grow. This is the legacy of Mercy Harrow, a child forced into the role of woman, her dreams smothered by duty, her innocence sacrificed to survival. The frontier shaped her fate, but it also tells us something larger, that progress and tragedy have always walked hand in hand across the pages of history. And so, when we look back at the American frontier, we must look beyond the myths of rugged cowboys and fearless settlers. We must remember the forgotten ones, the young girls like Mercy Harrow, whose stories remind us that history is not only built on triumph, but on the heavy price of survival. The frontier was not a place of ease or innocence. It was a land of unbroken wilderness, a place where survival demanded sacrifice, and where the burden of hardship often fell heaviest on those least able to carry it, the children. Among the countless nameless stories of suffering, one remains etched in whispers of the past, the haunting tale of Mercy Harrow. Mercy was born into a time when the frontier was both promise and peril. To settlers, the West offered the dream of new beginnings, wide fields to plow, rivers to drink from, and forests to tame. But behind this dream lived the brutal truth: hunger, isolation, and unrelenting labor. For Mercy, even before her 12th birthday, childhood had already become a stranger. While other girls might have held dolls, Mercy's hands were filled with needles, pots, and buckets of water drawn from cold, distant wells. Her mornings began before the roosters crow, tending to younger siblings whose cries pierced the thin wooden walls of their small cabin. Her laughter, once a melody of youth, grew faint beneath the weight of duties she never chose. Day after day, she moved further from innocence, taught that a girl's worth was measured not in joy, but in service. On the frontier, time moved differently. Childhood did not linger. A girl's path was marked not by education or play, but by how soon she could step into the role of wife and mother. For Mercy, that moment came with cruel swiftness. At only 12 years old, her parents, pressured by poverty, fear, and the customs of their time, promised her hand in marriage. A child was forced to stand at an altar she could barely see over, her veil masking not excitement, but confusion and dread. And so Mercy Harrow, not yet grown, became both wife and soon-to-be mother. Pregnant at 12, she faced the reality of bringing new life into the world while still caught in the fragility of her own. The laughter of childhood was gone, replaced by the cries of her own body struggling to bear the burden of womanhood far too soon. The frontier, with its endless sky and unforgiving land, mirrored her plight. It was vast yet merciless, beautiful yet brutal. Just as settlers plowed fields from raw earth, Mercy's life was carved and reshaped before it could bloom naturally. She became a reflection of that world, unyielding on the outside, but fragile within. History often remembers the frontier as a land of heroes, pioneers, and bold expansion. But behind those tales of triumph were the silenced voices of the vulnerable. Mercy's story is a reminder that for every golden field harvested, there was a child's laughter lost. For every homestead built, a girl's childhood stolen. Her tragedy teaches us that progress, when built upon the sacrifice of innocence, leaves behind scars that time cannot erase. Mercy Harrow never had the chance to dream freely, to grow slowly, to discover herself before the world claimed her. She was a child bound by the expectations of a hard land and a harsher society. As we look back upon the era of the frontier, we must remember it was not just a story of rugged men and fearless women carving their place in history. It was also the story of children, like Mercy, whose interrupted childhoods remind us that survival often came at a heartbreaking cost. Mercy's name may fade in the wind of history, but her story echoes still. A girl wed and pregnant at 12, her life speaks to us across time, a plea to honor the innocence of childhood, to protect what she was never allowed to keep. The American frontier was more than wide landscapes, vast plains, and distant horizons. It was a place where survival dictated every choice, where families clung desperately to customs, believing that old traditions offered safety against an uncertain tomorrow. But sometimes, tradition weighed heavier than compassion, and in that weight, lives were crushed. This is the story of Mercy Harrow, a girl whose childhood ended before it ever began. Mercy was born in the late 1800s, when the frontier stretched across a land both unforgiving and full of promise. She was the daughter of settlers who lived in a world where every hand was needed, every back bent toward survival. For families like the Harrows, daughters were not only children, they were bargaining chips. Girls could be married off to secure alliances, to bind families together, or to bring a promise of stability. And in that harsh reality, Mercy's life was never truly her own. From her earliest days, Mercy was known for her spirit. She ran through fields barefoot, her laughter mingling with the wind, her eyes always searching the horizon. Yet, even as a child, she sensed the weight of expectation pressing upon her shoulders. Her parents spoke in hushed voices when they thought she could not hear. Names of men were discussed, not as suitors for the future, but as contracts for the present. At just 12 years old, Mercy was told her destiny. She was to be married. No choice. No voice. Just the stern look of her father and the silent resignation of her mother, who had lived the same story decades before. For Mercy, this was not a fairy tale wedding. It was the death of her girlhood. Her groom was nearly 3 times her age, a man who valued what she represented more than who she was. In the eyes of tradition, this was a victory. Her family was secured, her future determined. But in Mercy's heart, it was a sentence. Pregnant before she reached her teenage years, Mercy's body was burdened by responsibilities it was never ready to bear. Each day was a battle, not only against the dangers of childbirth in an era with little medical help, but also against the despair of knowing that her life was written by others. Neighbors whispered her name, some with pity, others with approval, for such marriages were not rare. On the frontier, tradition excused cruelty, and compassion was often buried beneath the demands of survival. Her story reveals the silent suffering of countless girls like her, whose lives were traded in the name of custom. Mercy's dreams of freedom, to run across fields, to choose her own destiny, were locked away behind the walls of expectation. The frontier was painted in the colors of resilience and adventure, but beneath that romantic vision lay shadows, shadows of broken youth, stolen innocence, and generations of women who bore the weight of tradition so heavily that their voices were never heard. Mercy Harrow's tragedy is not just her own. It is the story of a time and a place where the measure of a daughter's worth was found not in her laughter, her spirit, or her dreams, but in the bargains made by men at a wooden table in a candlelit room. The lesson her life leaves us is clear. The frontier may have forged strength and survival, but it also revealed how deeply tradition could wound when it eclipsed compassion. Mercy Harrow stands as a haunting reminder. Freedom, no matter the century, should never be denied to the innocent. Her story, carried on in whispers of history, warns us of the dangers of a world where tradition is heavier than kindness, and where little girls are forced to carry burdens far greater than their years. The American frontier was more than wide landscapes, vast plains, and distant horizons. It was a place where survival dictated every choice, where families clung desperately to customs, believing that old traditions offered safety against an uncertain tomorrow. But sometimes, tradition weighed heavier than compassion, and in that weight, lives were crushed. This is the story of Mercy Harrow, a girl whose childhood ended before it ever began. Mercy was born in the late 1800s, when the frontier stretched across a land both unforgiving and full of promise. She was the daughter of settlers who lived in a world where every hand was needed, every back bent toward survival. For families like the Harrows, daughters were not only children, they were bargaining chips. Girls could be married off to secure alliances, to bind families together, or to bring a promise of stability. And in that harsh reality, Mercy's life was never truly her own. From her earliest days, Mercy was known for her spirit. She ran through fields barefoot, her laughter mingling with the wind, her eyes always searching the horizon. Yet, even as a child, she sensed the weight of expectation pressing upon her shoulders. Her parents spoke in hushed voices when they thought she could not hear. Names of men were discussed, not as suitors for the future, but as contracts for the present. At just 12 years old, Mercy was told her destiny. She was to be married. No choice. No voice. Just the stern look of her father and the silent resignation of her mother, who had lived the same story decades before. For Mercy, this was not a fairy tale wedding. It was the death of her girlhood. Her groom was nearly 3 times her age, a man who valued what she represented more than who she was. In the eyes of tradition, this was a victory. Her family was secured, her future determined. But in Mercy's heart, it was a sentence. Pregnant before she reached her teenage years, Mercy's body was burdened by responsibilities it was never ready to bear. Each day was a battle, not only against the dangers of childbirth in an era with little medical help, but also against the despair of knowing that her life was written by others. Neighbors whispered her name, some with pity, others with approval, for such marriages were not rare. On the frontier, tradition excused cruelty, and compassion was often buried beneath the demands of survival. Her story reveals the silent suffering of countless girls like her, whose lives were traded in the name of custom. Mercy's dreams of freedom, to run across fields, to choose her own destiny, were locked away behind the walls of expectation. The frontier was painted in the colors of resilience and adventure, but beneath that romantic vision lay shadows, shadows of broken youth, stolen innocence, and generations of women who bore the weight of tradition so heavily that their voices were never heard. Mercy Harrow's tragedy is not just her own. It is the story of a time and a place where the measure of a daughter's worth was found not in her laughter, her spirit, or her dreams, but in the bargains made by men at a wooden table in a candlelit room. The lesson her life leaves us is clear. The frontier may have forged strength and survival, but it also revealed how deeply tradition could wound when it eclipsed compassion. Mercy Harrow stands as a haunting reminder. Freedom, no matter the century, should never be denied to the innocent. Her story, carried on in whispers of history, warns us of the dangers of a world where tradition is heavier than kindness, and where little girls are forced to carry burdens far greater than their years. In the raw, unforgiving landscapes of the American frontier, survival often demanded sacrifices that today would seem unthinkable. The frontier was not a land of comfort. It was a land of hardship, hunger, and endless struggle. Every decision a family made could mean the difference between life and death, fortune and ruin. And within this crucible of survival, choices were often made that crushed the dreams of children before they ever had the chance to bloom. This is the story of one such child. Her name was Mercy Harrow. Mercy was born into a world of endless horizon and ceaseless toil. Her family were settlers, carving their existence out of wild land where every plank of wood and every handful of grain had to be fought for. To them, the world was not about fairness, but endurance. And in this world, a daughter's worth was measured less by her laughter and more by what alliances she could secure for the family's survival. At just 12 years old, Mercy was told she was to be married. For her family, it was not a question of love. It was not even a question of choice. To them, it was a bargain, a transaction, a way to ensure security, to gain land, to form ties with someone older and wealthier who could guarantee food through the long winters and protection against the unknown dangers of the frontier. To her parents, it was survival. To Mercy, it was betrayal. The day of her wedding was meant to be a day of joy, but for Mercy, it was the death of her childhood. The wooden church where the ceremony was held smelled of dust, candle wax, and resignation. The vow spoken there did not bind two souls in love, but instead chained a child to a man decades her senior. A man who looked at her not as a girl, but as property, as a vessel for heirs, as part of the bargain he had struck. The chains of that moment would never leave her. Mercy was still a child who longed to play in fields, to dream, to imagine a life not yet defined. But from the moment the pastor's words hung in the air, those dreams were silenced. The girl within her began to fade, replaced by a hollow echo of obedience. Her world, once wide and filled with possibility, narrowed into a single path she could not escape. By 13, Mercy was pregnant. The weight of her condition crushed her body and spirit alike. The whispers in the town shifted from shock to silence, as though people knew and yet chose not to see. On the frontier, where every family had secrets born of desperation, Mercy's suffering was just another hidden story. But for her, every day was a reminder of the life she had been denied. The frontier, for all its talk of freedom, was not free for women like Mercy. It was a prison built not from bars, but from expectations, bargains, and survival. Every woman was expected to sacrifice, to give her body, her youth, her spirit, for the sake of her family. But Mercy was only 12. She was still learning to braid her hair, still clinging to childhood, when she was asked to bear the burdens of womanhood. And so, Mercy Harrow's story is not just her own. It is the story of countless forgotten girls on the edge of the frontier, swallowed by history's silence. They were traded in bargains, bound by vows they could not understand, and left to carry the weight of a world that never saw them as children. Her life is a haunting lesson of the Gilded Age and the frontier it shaped, a time when the shimmer of opportunity came at a terrible human cost. When families, desperate to survive, made choices that condemned their daughters to lives of sorrow. Mercy's tragedy lies not just in her marriage, nor in her pregnancy, but in the world that allowed it, excused it, and even justified it. A world where a 12-year-old girl could be told her only worth was in the alliances her body could secure. She was wed at 12, pregnant at 13, and broken before she was ever given the chance to live. And as history moves forward, Mercy Harrow's story stands as a dark shadow behind the glittering myth of the American frontier, a reminder that the cost of survival was often paid in innocence, in youth, and in lives never fully lived. The story of Mercy Harrow is not just about one young girl, but about the cruel lessons written into the fabric of America's early frontier. Her life reveals how innocence was too often stripped away in a land that demanded strength, endurance, and sacrifice beyond what any child should bear. Mercy Harrow was only 12 years old when her life was forever changed. In the world of the 19th century frontier, childhood was a fleeting thing. Families relied on every pair of hands to survive, and girls were often seen less as daughters and more as future wives, mothers, and workers. The expectations were harsh, and the consequences devastating. At an age when most children today are just beginning to understand the world, Mercy was given away in marriage. Her family, burdened by poverty and the grinding demands of frontier life, believed it was a practical choice. Marrying her off meant one less mouth to feed and the promise of a husband's protection. But protection on the frontier was fragile, and Mercy would soon discover that marriage meant not safety, but a lifetime of trials. Within months of her wedding, Mercy's childhood ended completely. Her young body, not yet ready for womanhood, was forced into it by the weight of pregnancy. At 12 years old, she carried life inside her, though she was still a child herself. The women of the settlement whispered prayers for her survival. They knew the dangers. Too many girls, like Mercy, had been lost to childbirth before they had even reached maturity. The frontier was merciless. Winter stretched on in icy silence, the land unforgiving, the work unending. Mercy's days were filled with endless toil. She was expected to tend the fire, haul water, mend clothes, and prepare meals. The labor of survival pressed down on her fragile body, already strained by pregnancy. Each step, each task, carried with it not only physical exhaustion, but the heavy weight of fear. For Mercy, what should have been years of play and discovery became a nightmare of responsibility. She lived with constant pain and exhaustion, her body aching under the demands of both the land and the life growing inside her. Nights were no kinder. She would lie awake, her thoughts filled with dread of the months to come, of the child she would soon have to bring into a world that had shown her no kindness. The isolation of the frontier only deepened her suffering. There were no doctors nearby, no comforts of modern medicine, only midwives whose experience was built on trial and error. The nearest town might have been days away, and travel was often impossible during the brutal winter months. In this isolation, Mercy's fate was sealed long before her time. Her story embodies the brutal truth of frontier life. It was not only the land that demanded sacrifices, but also society itself. Girls like Mercy were denied the right to grow, to learn, to dream. They were thrust into adult roles before their bodies and minds were ready, their futures swallowed by the unyielding needs of survival. As Mercy's pregnancy advanced, her struggle became a visible reminder of the cost of life on the frontier. Every villager could see the toll it took. The sight of her small frame, carrying such a heavy burden, haunted those around her. It was not uncommon for women in the community to quietly confess their fear that Mercy would not live to see adulthood, and when the time came for her to give birth, the ordeal was as cruel as it was inevitable. Without proper care, with her body too young to endure such suffering, Mercy's labor stretched on in agonizing hours. Her cries echoed through the small cabin, each one a desperate plea for relief. In those moments, the fragility of youth collided with the brutal demands of frontier life. Whether Mercy survived or not remains uncertain in the scattered records of her time, but what is certain is this: her story, like many others lost to history, is a testament to how the frontier devoured innocence. Mercy Harrow was a child who never had the chance to be one. Her life, wed at 12, pregnant before she had grown, and thrust into labor by both society and nature, stands as a tragic reminder of a past that was far more cruel than romantic. The frontier was not only about courage and expansion. It was also about sacrifice, silence, and the stolen childhoods of girls like Mercy. Her story forces us to see beyond the myths of rugged pioneers and glittering opportunities, and to remember the lives that were quietly broken along the way. Innocence Lost is not just about the history of a single girl, but about the many Mercies who bore the weight of a world too heavy for their small shoulders. The frontier was a place of hope and hardship, a land where dreams of freedom and fortune clashed with the brutal reality of survival. Families traveled westward with wagons full of possessions, and hearts filled with promise. But the further they pushed into untamed lands, the harsher life became. Food was scarce, winters were long, and death was never far from the doorstep. But within this world of dust, hunger, and backbreaking labor, there was a cruelty even deeper than the wilderness itself. The suffering endured in silence by women and young girls. Among them was one whose story still echoes across history, Mercy Harrow. Mercy was born in 1847 in a small log cabin on the edge of the Missouri frontier. She was the third daughter of a family that believed children were both blessings and laborers, destined to serve the needs of their household and community. From the moment she could walk, Mercy was handed responsibilities far heavier than her small frame could bear. At 6, she carried water from the creek. At 8, she was cooking over a fire. And by 10, she was tending to her younger siblings as though she herself were already a mother. Childhood was not something she ever truly knew. It was replaced by duty. Life on the frontier was unforgiving. Death from illness or accident was so common that families rarely spoke of mourning. It was an expected rhythm of existence. But even in this world of constant loss, the burdens placed upon young girls like Mercy were crushing. Society dictated that a girl was valuable not for her mind, not for her dreams, but for how quickly she could become a wife and mother. For Mercy, that moment came with cruel swiftness. In the winter of 1859, when she was just 12 years old, Mercy was wed to a man nearly 3 times her age. He was a farmer with land and livestock, and to Mercy's family, the match was security. For Mercy, it was a life sentence. Her wedding dress was little more than a patched Sunday gown. Her vows were words she scarcely understood. And by spring, she was pregnant. The weight of pregnancy on her fragile body was immense. She was still a child, her bones not fully formed, her spirit not yet given a chance to grow. Yet, on the frontier, there was no sympathy. Laboring in the fields during the day and enduring the aches of pregnancy by night, Mercy carried her child in silence. Her cries were swallowed by the endless sound of axes splitting wood, the plow tearing into the soil, and the constant hum of survival that drowned out personal suffering. Her childbirth came on a stormy night. Rain lashed against the cabin walls, and the midwife, an elderly woman from a neighboring homestead, arrived just in time. Mercy's screams pierced the night as lightning lit the sky, but there was no comfort for her. After hours of agony, her body gave way. The child survived, but Mercy did not. She was 12 years old. Her husband buried her in a shallow grave at the edge of the farm, marked only by a wooden cross. The newborn, too fragile to live without its mother's milk, followed her into the earth within weeks. And with that, Mercy Harrow's story ended, lost in the dust and silence of the frontier. But what makes her story tragic is not only the cruel hand dealt to her, it is that her suffering was invisible. She was not the first, nor the last, young girl forced into womanhood before her time. Across the frontier, countless Mercies endured the same fate, their voices silenced, their lives reduced to statistics in old church records and forgotten graves. The frontier promised opportunity, but it demanded sacrifice. Men carved farms out of wilderness, but women and children often paid the price in silence. Mercy's story teaches us that progress is not only measured in land conquered or towns built, but in the voices ignored, in the lives cut short before they had even begun. Today, her name is barely remembered. Her grave is long lost. Yet, by telling her story, we uncover a truth the frontier tried to bury, that survival was never just about braving the wilderness. It was about enduring the quiet cruelties within the walls of one's own home. Mercy Harrow's life reminds us that history is not just the tale of explorers and settlers, of men with rifles and axes. It is also the story of young girls whose cries were drowned by the sound of progress. Her suffering, once invisible, becomes visible again when we remember. And in remembering, we honor not just Mercy, but all the forgotten souls of the frontier who carried burdens too heavy for their small shoulders. The frontier. It was a land of promise, yet also a land of shadow. A place where opportunity and survival walked hand in hand, where the hunger for freedom collided with the unforgiving weight of hardship. It is here, on this untamed landscape, that we find the story of Mercy Harrow, a story not of triumph, but of a childhood lost to duty, to expectation, and to the merciless gaze of a society that saw women as vessels before it ever saw them as souls. Mercy Harrow was born into a family of settlers in the early decades of the 19th century, when the frontier was still a dream carved into endless forests and stretching prairies. Her parents, like many others, had come seeking land and a future. But for Mercy, there would be no childhood of wonder, no years of innocence. Instead, her life was scripted by the traditions of her time, traditions that weighed heavily upon the smallest of shoulders. At 12 years old, Mercy was still a child. She loved the simple joys of the world, weaving wildflowers into her hair, trailing barefoot through the grass, listening to her mother's voice by the fireside. Yet before her laughter could grow into a young woman's freedom, her family arranged her marriage. The reasons were practical, as they so often were. A settlement needed alliances, families needed security, and daughters were part of the bargain. Mercy's life became a contract sealed by custom, her innocence exchanged for survival. The wedding was small, attended not by dreams, but by obligations. Neighbors congratulated the union. To them, it was not unusual. A girl was expected to become a wife, and a wife was expected to become a mother. Mercy, however, was still a child standing in borrowed shoes, the fabric of her dress heavy on her thin shoulders. The ceremony may have bound her to her husband, but it could not bind her heart to the reality that awaited. Pregnancy came quickly. At 12 years old, Mercy's body carried the burden of womanhood, while her soul still clung to childhood. When the child was born, she became both mother and daughter at once. Her small arms cradled a newborn, while her heart longed for her own mother's embrace. In the flicker of candlelight, she would rock the baby, whispering lullabies she barely remembered from her own nursery days. Her voice was tender, but her spirit was breaking. The frontier offered no mercy to the weak. There was work to be done, mouths to feed, and endless chores that spared neither the old nor the young. To her community, Mercy had fulfilled her duty. She was a wife and a mother, and that was all they saw. But within the silence of her heart, she wondered, was this all there would ever be? A lifetime of sacrifice, without the freedom to dream, without the time to simply be a child. This is the shadow of motherhood on the frontier. Behind the tales of rugged pioneers and bold expansion lies the quiet suffering of countless girls like Mercy Harrow. Their stories were rarely written, their names often forgotten. But their lives remind us of the price that was paid in a society where survival overshadowed compassion, and where the innocence of children was too often surrendered to the demands of custom. Mercy's life is not just a single tragedy, it is a lesson. A lesson that the frontier was not only built on courage and determination, but also on sacrifice and silence. It teaches us that progress often comes at the expense of the vulnerable, and that in the pursuit of building nations, individual lives were sometimes crushed beneath the weight of expectation. When we look back on the frontier, we see wide horizons and open skies, but hidden in that vastness are stories like Mercy's, stories that remind us that history is not only measured in victories, but also in the quiet voices of those who were never given the chance to choose their own destiny. The American frontier was a place of both promise and peril. To many, it represented new beginnings, the chance to carve out a life from the raw wilderness, to own land, to build families, to create legacies. But beneath the dream of the frontier lay harsh realities: starvation, disease, isolation, and social structures that were often merciless to those most vulnerable. And within this unforgiving landscape lived Mercy Harrow, a young girl whose story reminds us that the frontier was not only about brave pioneers and bold adventurers, but also about children robbed of their innocence, women denied their voices, and families broken under the weight of survival. Mercy Harrow was only 12 years old when her life was irrevocably changed. In many frontier communities, marriages were arranged early, not for love but for survival. A girl's body, no matter how small or fragile, was often seen as a resource, another hand to work the land, another vessel to carry children who would, in time, become laborers themselves. Mercy became a bride before she had ever learned what it meant to be a child. She was wed to a man twice her age, a farmer hardened by loss, who saw in her not a partner but a necessity. At first, Mercy's world was filled with confusion. She had been playing with dolls and daydreaming by the creek only months earlier. Now she was expected to cook, clean, and share the bed of a grown man. Her body, still developing, was forced into the demands of womanhood far too soon. By the time she was 12 years old, she carried within her the weight of a pregnancy. The settlers whispered that this was common enough, that many girls before her had endured the same fate. But Mercy's frail frame and tender age made her situation especially perilous. The frontier was a land where food was scarce, and even strong men often wasted away from hunger. For a girl like Mercy, malnutrition gnawed at her bones, weakening her with every passing day. The demands of pregnancy on such a fragile body were immense. Neighbors remembered her figure growing thinner even as her belly swelled, her cheeks hollowing, her eyes carrying a haunting sadness. She rarely smiled anymore, but worse than hunger and exhaustion was the loneliness. Mercy had no mother to guide her, no sisters to comfort her. The women around her, many hardened by their own tragedies, offered little tenderness. They too had been child brides once. They too had suffered silently. In Mercy's eyes, the sorrow of generations seemed to live, a grief not only for herself but for all the young girls before her, and all those who would come after, bound by the same chains of fate. When her time came to give birth, the ordeal nearly killed her. Frontier medicine was rudimentary at best, and childbirth was one of the greatest killers of women. For a girl of 12, the dangers multiplied tenfold. The labor was long, excruciating, and without mercy. Witnesses said her screams carried across the fields like the cries of a wounded animal. Hours stretched into days, and when at last the child was born, Mercy was left broken in both body and spirit. Though she survived the birth, Mercy was never the same. Exhaustion clung to her body frail, her soul hollow. Her husband saw her less as a wife and more as a tool, someone who had fulfilled her purpose. She was no longer a girl, but she was not truly a woman either. She existed in a shadowed space, robbed of her girlhood, stripped of her future. Some say Mercy's eyes told the story more than her voice ever could. They looked far older than her years, carrying not just her own sorrow, but that of countless women whose lives had been reduced to survival, their dreams discarded in the dust of the frontier. Mercy Harrow's story is not widely remembered, but it is emblematic of a broader truth about the frontier. The Gilded Age may have painted a picture of wealth, innovation, and progress, but the lives of ordinary people, especially women and children, were often marked by silent suffering. For every tale of gold strikes and vast ranches, there were hundreds of stories like Mercy's, hidden in the margins of history, whispered but never recorded. Her breaking point came quietly. The exhaustion of malnutrition, the endless demands of early motherhood, and the unrelenting loneliness became too heavy to bear. One winter evening, Mercy was found collapsed near the hearth, her body too weak to rise. Some say she simply faded away, her spirit leaving before her 13th birthday. Others claim she lingered, her life stretched out in quiet suffering. But in every telling, her fate remains the same. Mercy Harrow was one of countless young lives consumed by the hardships of a world that offered her no choice, no freedom, no hope. The frontier demanded sacrifices, and for many, those sacrifices were unbearable. Mercy's story is not only a tragedy but a reminder, an echo of history that calls to us across the centuries. It tells us that the triumphs of the past were built not only on courage and resilience but also on untold suffering, particularly of the voiceless. As we look back, the lesson is clear. Progress must never come at the cost of innocence, and the stories of those silenced by history, like Mercy Harrow, must never be forgotten. The frontier was a place of promise, a land where men spoke of opportunity, of vast fields ready for the plow, of rivers rich with fish, and skies that stretched endlessly. It was a new beginning for many, but it was also a place of harsh demands, silent suffering, and unspoken sacrifices. For every farmstead that rose from the soil, there were hidden costs, and sometimes those costs were paid by the most vulnerable. This is the story of Mercy Harrow. Mercy was only a child, 12 years old, when her life was decided for her. In the rough-hewn cabins of the frontier, childhood was a luxury most could not afford. Survival required alliances, and families forged them in ways that often disregarded innocence. Mercy was given in marriage, not because she was ready, not because she understood the meaning of vows or commitment, but because her family believed it would secure their future. Her husband was twice her age, a man hardened by years of labor and loneliness. To the community, their union was practical. To Mercy, it was bewildering. At 12, she still clung to rag dolls and whispered secrets to the wind. But the frontier was unyielding. It demanded strength where there was fragility, and it mistook silence for consent. Soon, Mercy was with child. Her small frame bore a burden her body was not prepared to carry. Nights were long and restless. Days were filled with exhaustion and fear. While other girls her age played with ribbons and helped their mothers gather berries, Mercy's days were marked by nausea, pain, and the unrelenting weight of expectation. Around her, life went on as if nothing was wrong. Neighbors spoke of harvests, cattle, and the endless struggle against the elements, but not of the child bride suffering quietly in their midst. The frontier prided itself on resilience, on the idea that every hardship was simply a test of will. But in that pride lay a blindness, a refusal to see the human cost of progress. Mercy's tragedy was invisible, dismissed as the natural order of things. Her labor came too soon, too violently. The small cabin filled with cries, some hers, some the midwife's commands, and some the desperate prayers of her mother. For hours she battled, her young body straining against the impossible. When at last the child arrived, Mercy's strength was gone. Some say she smiled faintly, reaching out to touch the tiny hand of her baby. Others said her eyes stared blankly, already slipping beyond the reach of this world. Mercy Harrow died at 12 years old, her story buried beneath the soil of the frontier. To the community, her death was one of many. People spoke of her as if she were part of the inevitable sacrifices demanded by a hard land. Progress had a price, they said, and Mercy's life was just one of its countless payments. But if we pause, if we truly listen to her story, we begin to see more. We see the loneliness of a child who never had the chance to grow. We see a community that confused endurance with indifference. And we see the darker truth of the frontier, that while it forged legends of courage, it also concealed tragedies of silence. The lesson of Mercy Harrow is not just about one girl, long forgotten by history. It is about the countless children, the vulnerable, and the silenced, who bore the weight of choices made by others. Her story reminds us that resilience should never mean blindness, and that progress should never demand innocence. As it's told on the frontier, the horizon stretched wide, filled with promise. But for Mercy, it ended too soon. This was the tragic story of Mercy Harrow, wed and pregnant at 12, remembered today not as a casualty of progress, but as a voice calling from history, asking us never again to turn away. The frontier was a place of promise and peril. It stretched endlessly, a land of raw wilderness, unbroken soil, and untamed opportunity. For some, it was a land of freedom and fortune. For others, it was a land of loneliness, silence, and unbearable hardship. And within its vast and merciless expanse lived Mercy Harrow, a child who never had the chance to be a child. Mercy was born in the mid-1800s, during an era when the frontier was seen as both the future and the final test of endurance. Families packed wagons, crossed rivers, and carved out homes in the wilderness. The government called it expansion. Pioneers called it survival. But for Mercy, it was a cage. She was only 12 years old when her childhood ended. The laws of the time did not protect girls like her. Instead, tradition and necessity bound her to a fate she could not choose. At 12, Mercy was married to a man more than twice her age, a man who had land, oxen, and the approval of her parents, but no understanding of innocence lost. By 13, she carried a child of her own. The cabin she lived in was small, one room with rough timber walls, a dirt floor, and a hearth that never seemed to warm her bones. Outside, the wind howled through the trees. Inside, Mercy prayed. She prayed for deliverance, for the childhood stolen from her, for the laughter she once shared with other girls before life pressed her into the role of wife and mother. On the frontier, survival came first. Love and tenderness came last, if they came at all. Men worked the fields, women bore the children, and children became adults before their voices had even lost their childish lilt. Mercy's cries at night went unheard. The wilderness had no mercy, and neither did the men who believed they were building civilization out of the wild. By the time she was 14, Mercy's body was fragile from childbirth. She had known only fear, exhaustion, and silence. The neighbors spoke of her as if she were a woman, but in truth, she was still a child carrying a child, trapped in a cycle that broke so many frontier women before her. Her small hands, once meant for play, were now cracked and blistered from work. Her eyes, once bright with dreams, dulled under the weight of suffering. The tragedy of Mercy Harrow was not just her own. It was the tragedy of countless forgotten girls of the frontier, whose names never entered history books, whose lives were lost in childbirth, whose spirits were crushed under the demands of survival. For every story of a pioneer family that triumphed, there were a dozen silent stories of children like Mercy, forced to grow old before they were even grown. Behind closed doors, Mercy wept. The walls of her cabin held her cries and muffled them back as silence. No one paused to listen. No one came to save her. She was 12, married, and pregnant, her fate sealed by the unforgiving law of the frontier. Her story is a reminder that the frontier was not just about exploration and progress. It was about sacrifice, loss, and the unseen suffering of those too small, too powerless, to resist the demands of their time. Mercy Harrow's voice may have been silenced, but her struggle speaks through the silence of history. The American frontier has always carried with it a mythology of boundless opportunity, of men carving empires from wilderness, of families building lives upon raw soil, of courage against the elements. But behind that shining legend lies a darker truth, one often hidden in the shadows of history. The story of Mercy Harrow is one such truth. Her life was not a tale of freedom, but of fragility. Not of endless opportunity, but of endless endurance. Mercy Harrow was born in 1862, a child of dust and timber, in a settlement clinging desperately to survival on the outer edge of the frontier. Her family, like so many others, had been lured westward by whispers of land and independence, but what they found was hunger, isolation, and the constant fear that tomorrow might bring famine, disease, or worse. Mercy grew up among endless fields, dry winds, and the constant creak of wagons. Her world was small, a cabin, a church, and a schoolhouse she rarely entered, for from the start, Mercy's fate was not her own. In those times, girls were often seen less as individuals and more as burdens to be transferred, as pieces in the puzzle of survival. Education for girls was a luxury, not a right. And though Mercy's heart yearned for it, for books, for the written word, for the voice that literacy might give her, her hands were needed elsewhere. She was toiling in fields, raising younger siblings, and carrying the weight of womanhood before childhood had even released her. At the age of 12, Mercy's life took a tragic turn. She was married. To many in her community, it was not unusual. A girl of 12 was seen as ready for the responsibilities of a wife, especially on the frontier where life demanded labor and children ensured survival. But for Mercy, it was a shattering. Barely more than a child herself, she was thrust into a world of adult burdens, stripped of the fleeting innocence she might have known. Within months of her marriage, Mercy became pregnant. Her small body was not ready for motherhood, and yet the frontier demanded it. What followed was a cycle of hardship that would define the rest of her short life. Every day was labor, cooking, cleaning, tending to fields, bearing children. Every night was silence, a silence in which her secret dreams flickered and faded. Some accounts suggest Mercy longed for something greater, for an education that might lift her voice above the endless drone of survival. She dreamed of reading poetry, of writing her own letters, of stepping into a world that valued her not as property, but as a soul. But dreams on the frontier were fragile things, easily crushed by hunger, pregnancy, and the unrelenting cycle of toil. The harsh environment was not the only enemy Mercy faced. The culture of the frontier often left women invisible, their suffering unspoken, their desires dismissed. Mercy's story was one of countless others. Young girls promised away in marriage, forced into motherhood, while still yearning for their own childhoods. The weight of silence was heavy. And for Mercy, that silence eventually became her shroud. By her late teens, Mercy had given birth multiple times. Her body bore the scars of too many pregnancies too soon, with too little care. Her spirit bore the scars of dreams denied. She lived in a world that celebrated the rugged independence of men, while forgetting the silent endurance of women like her. And as the years wore on, her fragile hope flickered. We do not know exactly how Mercy's life ended. Some say she died young, in childbirth, her body simply unable to withstand the weight of another labor. Others whisper she faded slowly, her strength worn down by endless drudgery, until her light was extinguished. What remains is not the detail of her death, but the lesson of her life. The frontier was not only a land of promise, it was a land of sacrifice. For every fortune made, there was a life lost. For every man who carved out independence, there was a woman whose independence was stolen. Mercy Harrow's story reminds us that progress was built not only on ambition, but also on suffering, the suffering of those who were silenced, forgotten, and erased. Her name is not recorded in the annals of great pioneers. She left behind no memoirs, no letters, no celebrated legacy. But in remembering her, we see the truth of the frontier more clearly. It was not only about wide horizons and glittering dreams. It was about fragile hopes, hopes like Mercy's, too delicate to survive the weight of history. And so, the next time we speak of the American frontier, let us remember not just the heroes who conquered the wilderness, but also the children who were conquered by it. Let us remember Mercy Harrow, wed and pregnant at 12, a soul who longed for a voice, but whose story could only be told by others. Her tragedy is not just her own. It is the tragedy of a society that demanded everything, but offered nothing in return. This is the forgotten truth of the frontier. This is the fragile hope of Mercy Harrow. The frontier was a land of promise, but also of peril. In the late 19th century, America's westward expansion was not only about railroads, mines, and cattle towns. It was about families torn between survival and sacrifice. Out here, life was measured not in years, but in endurance. And for the young, the frontier could be merciless. This is the tragic story of Mercy Harrow, a girl born not into freedom, but into duty. Her life was written not by her own hand, but by the hands of others, her parents, her community, and a society that demanded sacrifice above all else. Mercy was only 12 years old when her childhood was stolen. A marriage arranged to a man twice her age was not uncommon in the remote settlements where survival came before sentiment. To her family, it meant security, a promise of land, and perhaps even protection from the ruthless forces of poverty. To Mercy, it meant the end of innocence. At an age when most children still clung to their dolls, Mercy was carrying a child of her own. The burden of pregnancy, heavy both in body and spirit, fell on shoulders not yet grown. She would walk with the other women to the well, her thin frame struggling beneath buckets of water, her steps heavy with exhaustion. Her laughter, once light and careless, was silenced. What should have been her girlhood years were swallowed by endless labor, fear, and the harsh expectations of the frontier. Neighbors whispered. Some pitied her, others judged her. But no one intervened. In those days, it was easier to look away than to challenge tradition. Mercy's suffering was woven into the fabric of a society that expected young girls to become wives and mothers before they had even learned what it meant to be women. As the years passed, the weight of Mercy's sorrow became unbearable. Stripped of choice, burdened with ceaseless labor, and haunted by the childhood she never lived, her mind began to unravel. What others dismissed as mere melancholy was, in truth, a descent into madness. By 20, Mercy was the mother of several children, yet her own eyes seemed hollow. windows to a soul that had long since broken. She would wander the fields alone, her hands brushing the tall grass as though searching for something she had lost. Sometimes she would hum lullabies, not to her children, but to herself, as if trying to soothe the child within her that never had a chance to grow. The frontier was unforgiving, and so was fate. Her husband, hardened by years of toil, showed no tenderness. To him, Mercy's despair was weakness. To her neighbors, her distant stare was just another burden of womanhood. No one saw that she was unraveling, piece by piece, thread by thread. It is said that in her final years, Mercy would often sit by the river, staring into its rushing waters. Children whispered that she spoke to voices no one else could hear. Some called it madness. Others believed it was sorrow so deep it reached beyond this world. In time, Mercy Harrow faded into legend, her story told in hushed tones as a cautionary tale. But beneath the whispers lies a truth more haunting. She was not a symbol, not a myth, she was a girl. A child who never had the chance to live as one. The frontier, often painted as a land of opportunity, was also a place where innocence was sacrificed on the altar of survival. Mercy's story is not just her own, it is the story of countless forgotten girls, silenced by time, remembered only as shadows in the pages of history. Mercy Harrow's life reminds us that progress is not always measured by railroads or gold strikes, but by the lives preserved or destroyed in its path. She was wed at 12, pregnant at 12, and broken long before her time. A casualty not of war, but of neglect. And so, her legacy is not in the children she bore, nor the farmstead she left behind, but in the haunting lesson she leaves us, that even in an age of expansion and triumph, there was tragedy, that beneath the myth of the frontier lies the sorrow of the forgotten, and that sometimes the greatest cruelty is silence. The story of Mercy Harrow begins not in comfort, but on the ragged edge of America's frontier. In the mid-19th century, the frontier was more than a line on a map. It was a crucible, a place where human endurance was tested against hunger, isolation, disease, and the weight of expectation. Families traveled westward in covered wagons, their eyes filled with dreams of land, freedom, and prosperity. But the reality was harsher, and for young girls like Mercy, the dream often turned into a nightmare. Mercy was born to a family that settled deep in the wilderness, where neighbors were scarce and survival demanded sacrifice. Her childhood was brief, almost non-existent. By the age of 12, when most children today are still learning to navigate the innocence of play, Mercy was married off. Such unions were not uncommon in the unforgiving world of the frontier, where girls were seen less as children and more as assets, workers, wives, and mothers who could bear the next generation. The man she was given to was older, a settler hardened by years of toil. He needed a wife, and Mercy's family needed security. For them, the marriage was practical. For her, it was a sentence. Soon after the vows were spoken, Mercy was pregnant. Her young body, still fragile and undeveloped, was forced into the role of motherhood far too soon. Life on the frontier offered no comfort to ease her burden. She worked from dawn to dusk, tending fires, hauling water, and laboring beside her husband in the fields. There was no reprieve, no gentleness. The endless landscape of the American wilderness, vast and unyielding, became both her prison and her graveyard of dreams. Pregnancy at 12 was perilous. Many young mothers died during childbirth in those years, their bodies simply too small to survive the ordeal. Some historians suggest Mercy bore 1 or 2 children, though records are scarce, and myths have tangled with memory. What is certain is that the weight of expectation was crushing. In a world that glorified frontier heroism, rugged men carving out homesteads, families braving the wilderness, there was no space to remember the silent suffering of girls like Mercy. Her story fades into mystery, as so many of these women's lives do. Some say she died young, her body weakened beyond repair by childbirth and ceaseless labor. Others whisper that one evening she wandered into the woods and never returned, swallowed by the silence of the trees. Perhaps it was an accident, or perhaps it was her final act of escape. Whatever the truth, her life ended not with triumph, but with disappearance, buried beneath the legends of frontier courage. Mercy Harrow's story reminds us that history often forgets those who did not fit the shining image of progress. We are told the frontier was a land of opportunity, a place where brave souls carved out new destinies. But behind the myth lies the truth. Countless children, especially girls, were sacrificed to the demands of survival and the hunger for expansion. Mercy was not a heroine in the traditional sense. She did not conquer land or lead great journeys. Instead, she was a victim of her time, of poverty, patriarchy, and the brutal indifference of a society that saw her body as a resource. The silence surrounding her death is as tragic as her short life. No grave, no records, no stories passed down through generations. Just whispers, half remembered and easily forgotten. Yet, in telling her story today, we pull back the veil on a past too often romanticized. We remember that for every tale of heroism, there were countless tragedies like Mercy's, hidden in the shadows of the frontier. The lesson of the frontier is not only about courage and endurance. It is also about loss, sacrifice, and the fragile lives left behind. Mercy Harrow's story is a haunting reminder that history is not made only by those who lived long and prospered, but also by those who vanished in silence, too young, too fragile, too forgotten. This was the final chapter of her life, a chapter that never should have been written so early. Mercy Harrow was just 12 years old, wed, pregnant, and lost to history. The American frontier. For many, it is remembered as a land of endless opportunity, rugged determination, and bold expansion. Stories of pioneers and settlers often glorify the endurance, the courage, and the victories of those who braved the wilderness. But beneath those triumphs lay another truth, one far darker, one that seldom made it into history books. It was a truth written on the lives of women and girls whose voices were silenced, whose suffering was hidden behind the wooden walls of cabins and the plowed fields of homesteads. This is where the story of Mercy Harrow begins. Mercy was born in 1843 in a small frontier settlement that clung to survival against hunger, storms, and raids. Her parents were among those who believed in the promise of new land, where hardship today meant prosperity tomorrow. But for Mercy, that promise would never come true. She was the second of 7 children, raised not on dreams of childhood games or education, but on the relentless demands of frontier life. By the age of 9, she was already laboring alongside her mother, cooking, hauling water, and tending to her siblings. Childhood on the frontier was short, and for Mercy, it ended before it even began. The turning point came when she was just 12. In a community where survival outweighed sentiment, girls were often seen less as daughters and more as future wives, bargains in the exchange of labor and alliances. At 12 years old, Mercy Harrow was given in marriage to a man more than twice her age, a farmer who needed another pair of hands in the fields and a womb to carry heirs. There was no ceremony of love, no tender promises. Only the cold practicality of the frontier, where a child's innocence was a luxury no one claimed could be afforded. Within months of her marriage, Mercy's body was forced into roles it was not ready for. At 12, she became pregnant. Her small frame, still more child than woman, bore the heavy burden of carrying life. The pregnancy was grueling, days of sickness, exhaustion, and fear. But Mercy had no choice. On the frontier, there was no escape, no voice loud enough to object, no law to protect her. She was a child trapped in a woman's world. When the time came to give birth, Mercy endured agony that words can scarcely describe. There were no trained doctors nearby, only midwives and neighbors, themselves hardened by years of suffering. Her body struggled, too young and too fragile for the ordeal. After hours of labor, Mercy gave birth. Some accounts say the child did not survive. Others suggest the infant lived only a few weeks. What is certain is that Mercy's health was shattered. The toll was immense, and for Mercy Harrow, life would never again hold even the faintest echo of childhood. Her story did not end there. Over the following years, Mercy bore more children, her body repeatedly tested beyond endurance. Each pregnancy was a reminder of her stolen youth, each birth a wound that never truly healed. By her late teens, Mercy's health had withered away. Illness, malnutrition, and exhaustion consumed her. She died before she reached 20, her life extinguished before it ever had a chance to bloom. Yet her name, Mercy Harrow, lingers as more than a forgotten tragedy. Her story shines a harsh light on the cost of survival in a world that celebrated resilience but ignored injustice. The frontier demanded sacrifice, but it was the young and the powerless who often paid the highest price. In Mercy's case, the cost was her childhood, her health, and her life. The lesson of the frontier is not only one of perseverance and courage. It is also a warning of what happens when humanity is overshadowed by necessity. Behind every log cabin there were women like Mercy, whose pain and silence went unheard. Behind every tale of victory were countless invisible tragedies. Mercy Harrow's short life reminds us that progress, when built upon the suffering of children, carries a shadow that can never be erased. As we reflect on the history of the American frontier, we must remember not just the heroes and the pioneers, but also the voiceless victims. Mercy Harrow was more than a footnote. She was a child whose story forces us to see the past in its full complexity, both the grit and the grief. And in remembering her, we honor those countless forgotten lives, and we vow never to let their suffering be lost to the silence of history.